and we're going to try to keep it simple, but it has to be scientific because you have to know the truth, is how we really measure metabolic condition. And you know, we're starting on our chronic disease temperature scale, the first two markers. We're just going to cover, keep it simple, insulin and glucose. Really, things that are very, very common. Okay, but hopefully we'll articulate some things you haven't heard before and show you what the real limits should be. It turns out that with glucose, the standard of care limits are actually pretty close to our limits. Dr. Carter, don't fret about chiming in about, you know, type 3 diabetes when we get to that point. But let's talk about, I don't have a specific slide deck, but I'll just show you where we're going to work from, and we're going to work through this entire slide deck in the course of the next year if you guys have that kind of endurance, okay? Just get your mental exercises going on to keep the brain sharp because, you know, but we're only going to cover it in small sound bites. So let's share the screen, and you know, I'll put it into a presentation mode in a second. Really what we're talking about is our chronic disease temperature biomarkers. And sadly, I don't have my report up here, but there it is. Let me pull up this report. And so, you know, if you've taken labs from me, you've seen this report, and we break it down by biomarker, glucose, A1C, insulin. Only we're going to talk about today is glucose and insulin. Triglycerides, uric acid, homocysteine, C-reactive protein, red blood cell distribution. We have 22 markers that we really focus, 21, 22 that we really focus hard in on. But then what we did is in this report, we looked at the markers that were most prevalent and most predictive of certain traditional conditions, you know, like diabetes, like cancer, like stroke, like heart disease, things of that nature. And so what we did is looked at the literature and said, what are the top 5 most predictive markers for those conditions? And there you have it. For diabetes, glucose, A1C, insulin, triglycerides, uric acid. For heart disease, white blood cell count, red blood cell distribution, neutrophils. We're missing a couple that are very, very specific, like brain nutritic peptide would be extraordinarily predictive for congestive heart failure, for example. Extremely focused on that condition. But from the broad sense of labs, you know, these are the best markers, stroke, so on and so forth. But then what we do is we give you a value for your risk scale. Now, what that does is appreciates the fact that, whoopsie, you know, health, this says COVID, but ignore that. It can be diabetes, it can be anything. We all lie on a continuum. And at some point, when we cross an artificial barrier heading in the wrong direction, medicine diagnoses it as a condition. Diabetes. You had a heart attack, you know, you're at risk for this, kidney disease, whatever. So it's really an artificial barrier, but we have to recognize that we all live on a continuum. So what this score does is kind of tell you the risk score for each of these conditions, tells you what the biomarkers are telling from a story perspective about where you are on that continuum. And in the standard of care, a diabetes diagnosis can be made just on an A1C value or just on a glucose value. And I don't think that's not an adequate story. And then the condition diabetes is really, the disease is insulin resistance. So whenever we're diagnosing diabetes, we always should have an insulin value because that's the underlying disease. And I'll show you as we go through this today how not having insulin as part of the picture to determine where your metabolic health, your diabetes or metabolic health, can actually create a misinterpretation. Dr. Carter, do you want to just give a summary on these two markers as I get queued
Well,
up?
I wanted to say, the insulin is a much more sensitive predictor way before you actually get a diagnosis of diabetes. So it could be 5 years or longer before your glucose or hemoglobin A1C actually increases. And that is what is missed, from the traditional, practitioner. And that's really the unfortunate thing. They talk about prevention and so forth, but they really don't know what is a true value for prevention. Well, let's put it this way. They know of the value, but none of them actually obtain that value. Now, once you're diabetic, yeah, they'll get an insulin and C-peptide and other parameters and all of that stuff. But if you are an apparently healthy person and you just happen in your normal set of labs to have a fasting glucose of 90, you are deemed normal. But underlying that, your insulin level could be far above what is considered an optimal number.
In my humble opinion, the two most important biomarkers that cost the least but span a broad spectrum of evaluation of your physiology is your fasting insulin and your white blood cell counts. We're not talking white blood cell counts today. We're talking insulin, but every longevity study, when they look at starvation or calorie restriction or keto status or what have you, every one of those things, or a vegan diet, when you look at what any of those things really do, it reduces your insulin to an optimal level. So like whenever anybody says, oh, fasting is good, or calorie restriction is good, these studies by Cynthia Kenyon on worms, they live X number of times longer. At the end of the day, it has to affect something physiological.
Right.
And the physiological thing it's affecting that is really measurable is your insulin. And insulin is just not an innocent bystander. It is a hormone that regulates cellular processes. Mm-hmm. Okay? So that's why insulin is so important. And glucose and these other markers for diabetes are surrogates to the master, insulin. And it's a shame we're not taking insulin as a standard measure. And of course we are. Okay? So let's dive into insulin. Let's see if I can make my slide deck full and you can still see it. Because sometimes it switches screens. And can you see it now or do you see Google?
Don't see anything.
Ugh.
We see you.
Oh, I haven't put it on screen share. That's why. I told you about that fermented beverage I had a little while.
It's a good one.
It's paying dividends. It is paying dividends. So I say something, and Dr. Carter's been kind enough not to challenge me on it. Because
sometimes,
well, in this particular one, because sometimes I say things more to make a point than to be completely scientifically accurate. But what I say here is insulin is a hormone. Hormones regulate the function of your body, and insulin has one job. Look, if you go to work, you have a job, but you also have other obligations, okay? So insulin has a main focus, and it's different than what you might have been told. Insulin's job is to keep your blood glucose levels within a narrow range. That's all. And the proof is anything that will take glucose, insulin will push it to. It's not exclusive just to your cells that need fuel. Okay? Some things that are not part of your body will take that glucose. A bacterial infection, for example. A cancer cell, for example. So that's the proof that insulin is not really like pinpoint precise. It's just trying to keep the glucose level in a narrow range. Why? Glucose is inflammatory. And the analogy I give, which I think is easier to understand, is oxygen. Right now, we're breathing 20.9% oxygen. Linda, a little bit less because she's up in Denver. But we have evolved to work in a very narrow range of oxygen. The death zone on Everest is only, what, 14, 15%. You can't be at 14 or 15%. And then if you're too high a level, you'll burn up. We're not, that's reactive oxygen species. We're not adapted to that. So at narrow range around 20% oxygen, our wear and tear from the reactive oxygen species of oxygen is met pretty well by repair and recovery. Okay? And the same with glucose. So glucose is toxic outside of a narrow range. So the brain, God, makes the pancreas produce insulin to keep it in the narrow range. So to Dr. Carter's point is, if you just measure glucose, maybe the insulin had to recruit more insulins to keep the glucose in that tight range.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then slowly, the insulin, the pancreas start losing the battle, and then the glucose goes up. And then the A1C goes up. So you don't want to be measured based on A1C, because that's a very trailing indicator. Do you want to know if Amazon is going to spike up? Or do you want to know that Amazon in the past already spiked up? You want to know what's happening in the future, and that's insulin.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas A1C, it's like that investment's long gone. It's bad. It's futile.
Yeah.
So keep your blood glucose levels within a narrow range. And the standard of care is actually pretty accurate on glucose, but they're extremely wrong on insulin. The ideal value is 2 to 4. And sometimes from a mortality perspective, it's really 2 to 6. But from an optimal health perspective, it's 2 to 4. But the standard of care will tell you that an insulin of 24.9 is normal. You are insulin resistant, and you can cross the transom into diabetes very easily at that level. I mean, the last 2 times I've got labs, I was flagged for my insulin being too low, because we're measuring some statistical measurement of people coming into LabCorp, and we're more and more insulin resistant. So our insulin's getting higher and higher. So people who are truly insulin sensitive are getting registered on the LabCorp test as abnormal, as freaks. We're not. I think your insulin, if you're very active, can be as low as, I don't know, Dr. Carter, what do you think the lower limit of not having a
1.5. I mean, obviously, too low, well then, the problem will be that your islet cells are not producing enough insulin. But yeah, in the 1.5 range, you're good.
Yeah, and I've been 1.6, and my wife comes to me, do you think you're becoming type 1 diabetic? I said, no, I think I'm in ketosis.
And yeah, as long as your fasting insulin is 1.5 and your glucose is between 70 and 85, then you're fine.
There you go.
But if your fasting insulin is 1.5 and your glucose is 150, then you have problems.
Now, I'm going to give you a name, Jason Fung, and I'll show you our website where we have in our learning management system an insulin resistance program. So if any of you have an insulin above 6, check your labs, ping me, and I'll put you in that program. It's an automated program that sends out content. But Jason Fung is the world guru on insulin and insulin resistance. And he says that a cell is resisting the action of insulin because it already has too much glucose in there. And there's another camp that says the membrane of the cell actually dumps receptors. So there are fewer insulin receptors on the surface when insulin has been constantly barraging the cell, trying to push fuel into it that the cell doesn't need. And you can see how it's a vicious cycle. It's a very simple thing. Harry, you love your wife, right?
Yes, sir.
But if you gave her a little nudge on her shoulder, it's a love tap, she'd respond kindly, correct?
Yes.
But what if you picked a friend of yours that you were horsing around with and you pushed him, and pick him on males, you pushed him a little aggressively, what is he likely to do?
Yeah, punch me back.
Exactly. And then if you punch him back, then it starts spiraling downhill. That's insulin resistance. The cell is resisting, but the insulin is pushing. So the cell pushes back, and then the insulin pushes back, and then the insulin brings more friends in, more insulin, and it keeps pushing. And so the cell goes into this position, and the next thing you know, you're diabetic. But it's really, the disease is insulin resistant. Okay? My dad would say with Boston accent, I've beaten a dead horse here, so I'll move on. But once again, insulin is somewhat agnostic from what I can see. And so if there's excess glucose floating around in your blood vessels, insulin's job is to get rid of it. So, hey, the cancer cell says, hey, I'm hungry. I'll take it. Diabetics statistically have much higher cancer and cancer mortality rate. And it's all a question of where you are on that insulin continuum that's going to make the difference. That's how you predict cancer risk. And that's why we have insulin on our cancer continuum. A fat cell. This is a natural process. We were designed for feast and famine. Feast, insulin goes up temporarily, pushes the sugar into the cell. The excess goes into the liver, converted to fatty acid for fat storage. And guess what? When you're in a famine, you burn the fat. Natural process. Very good thing. But when you're doing that, like our kids are with the big gulp drinks and the fast food, when you're doing that same process of feast and famine 3 times a day, that's when you become insulin resistant. And then pathogens, bacteria, viruses, they feed on something, particularly bacteria. I'm not schooled as Dr. Carter is on viruses. Are viruses feeding on glucose, Michael?
All pathogens can, yes.
Okay. So this is really the reason why diabetics have more cancer and why diabetics have more vascular disease, because they're feeding the pathogenic burden in their vasculature, in their cells, everywhere. Okay, so that's why we don't want to have it. Now here's some data. So insulin is a marker of early mortality risk. So in people with type 2 diabetes,
there's a lot of background noise. I don't know if that's your mic, but it's creating I don't know. I hear it. Does anyone else hear it?
Yeah, I hear it too.
We do too.
Hearing it.
I'm going to pop people on mute, and I'll take you out later. I don't know what the heck's going on with my stuff, and then you also probably hear the dog in the background, which I have no control over.
Oh, maybe I'm wondering if this is your microphone, though.
Yeah.
Let's switch to, let's see, do I dare switch on Zoom? Let me stop share and try to switch to my, let me try to switch to a different microphone. It's going to my built-in microphone.
Let's try this microphone. Alan, sorry I picked you up so late. Pardon me, everybody. Come on, Brad, you can come in. Okay, Nikki, nicely done. Come on. I just want everybody to know that I'm safe. My dog has protected me, and she's no
There
longer
you go.
barking. No, that's the key thing.
I think that might be better.
Okay, so now I'm
Yeah.
on a different microphone.
Yeah.
Alan, sorry to let you in so late. I'm having problems technically, but happy to have you aboard.
Oh, I was having technical problems too.
And you will be able to see the replay, so no problem. But let's just look at some curves. So, like I say, the standard of care is wrong. What's my proof? Okay, so here's a mortality risk curve. Mortality risk goes up.
You got to share your screen again, though.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah.
That probiotic is just phenomenal.
Absolutely.
So here's the standard of care value for insulin. And what we see is years with consistently high insulin levels and mortality risk. And we see that when the insulin is in the less than 6 range, here's your mortality risk. When it goes up to 6.4 to 9.3, 9.3 to 13.5, and then greater than 13, we see mortality go up. Now, I just want you to know that there aren't that many studies that show a nice graphical representation. But when I derived the number, Dr. Carter and I looked at the research, we didn't look at the ones that just had pretty graphs. So our values are based on multiple studies. Okay, but here's one that shows very nicely that as insulin goes up and none of these markers are outside of the standard of care, so they're all normal according to your regular doctor, your mortality goes up. And then here's the other thing. In people with type 2 diabetes, exogenous insulin, which means insulin therapy, not your own body producing insulin, you have an increase in all-cause mortality. In other words, more cancer deaths, more heart disease deaths, more stroke deaths, more diabetes deaths, all different types of kidney disease. All these things go up because it's affecting the vessels. At the end of the day, the excess glucose and the excess insulin is affecting the integrity of your vessels. Okay? So
It all becomes very toxic.
Yep. This is a concept that everybody needs to be aware of. It's called the U or J curve. So it's pretty simple. Think about blood pressure. If your blood pressure is 70 over 30, you're probably on the way out. But if your blood pressure is 250 over 120, you're probably on the way out too. But somewhere in the middle is a good number. Okay? And so insulin is the same thing. And if your insulin gets too low, you're heading into type 1 diabetes, and you no longer have control over insulin, and you need exogenous external insulin to keep your glucose under control. And if you don't get that, you're going to die, most likely, unless you can be in ketosis for the rest of your life. But you'll notice that in most situations, mortality increases more and more rapidly on the low end than it does on the high end. And this includes cholesterol, which we'll talk about in great detail, but it doesn't violate the U curve or J curve principle. And very few people have studied or at least talked about the low end of cholesterol, but it's extremely important to have optimal cholesterol, not low. Just a sidebar. Okay, so let's look at the next thing. So this is mortality in non-insulin dependent diabetics. So insulin dependent diabetics, their glucose is so high and their insulin has tapped out, their pancreas is tapped out, it can't produce any more insulin. So the only way to bring that glucose down is to give even more insulin from an external source. Now we're talking about people so those are really profoundly diabetic. But now we're talking about people that are just barely diabetic. So the non-insulin dependent diabetics. There, the overall mortality is twice that a person with diabetes. It's usually like a 6 or 10 year study. We follow the non-diabetic and the diabetic for 6 or 10 years, and 50%, twice as many of these have died, usually a vascular. the excess mortality is higher for those using insulin. So what does that tell you? That they're using insulin to control your diabetes, yet you're still dying at very high rates. So in some respects, it's the insulin causing the mortality,
That's right.
not as much the glucose. Because the excess insulin is lowering the glucose, yet you're still dying at a higher rate. Michael, you accept the way I
No, that was perfect. You know, because of the toxicity of insulin,
Right.
and also because the new insulins now are made from recombinant DNA technology, and they are ultimately more toxic. They actually cause an antibody response in numerous individuals.
Inflammatory.
Kind of think about the whole leaky gut syndrome, right? Where you're eating the gluten and dairy of today, which is different from 50 years ago. So the body recognizes it as a foreign invader. So the newer insulins are, even though they're lowering the glucose level, the body is recognizing it as a foreign invader. And whole cascade of things start happening from there.
Very interesting. Very interesting. But it's not just, this chart makes the case that it's not just the people on insulin. Middle-aged people lose 5 to 10 years of life expectancy when they're just diabetic, and they're not even to the extent that they need this supplemental insulin to control their glucose down to relatively normal levels. Causes of early death: vascular disease, cancer, stroke, and diabetes. You can see this is a broad-reaching condition. So that excess insulin, that excess glucose is really affecting the vasculature, but it's also feeding the fire of pathogens and cancer cells. So it's hurting us from many different ways. So that's really all we have to say on insulin. To summarize, and for Alan's benefit, insulin's a hormone. These are master regulators. Diabetes is best well characterized. It's a man-made or human-made term, but the best way to measure where you are on the diabetes or metabolic continuum is really looking at fasting insulin levels, not the glucose, not the A1C. The insulin is the primary marker and the first marker to go up. To summarize, insulin is trying to keep your glucose in a narrow range where it's less toxic and your body can handle the repair and recovery created by the damage of an oxidizing substance like glucose. So insulin will continue to go up to try to keep it in that range. And at some point, if you continue to comport yourself in a wrong way, the insulin will start losing the battle, and then glucose will start going up. And then your A1C will start going up. So insulin is the first key that you're heading in the wrong direction. And we want everybody to be 2 to 4. Fasting insulin, 2 to 4, optimal health. No higher than 6. I had someone at 5.9 today, and I'm saying, that's wonderful, but it's not good enough. You know, so that's the way we got to look at it. Now let's look at glucose. And of course, I didn't get ahead of my slides, but really, this just shows you, we're not talking about triglycerides or A1C today, but really, insulin goes up first. Then when it starts losing the battle, the glucose goes up. Triglycerides will go up at some point too, but then A1C is definitely the last one to go up.
Insulin's driving.
And guess what? When you're coming out of diabetes, A1C is the last one to come down. So like you may be making progress, but your A1C is still up. And your doctor's saying you're not making progress. Well, A1C is looking back 4 to 6 months. So when your doctor tells you you're not making progress, he's really telling you, he or she is telling you, you're not making progress 6 months, 4 to 6 months ago. So tell your doctor, I want a fasting insulin, because that's telling me real time what's going on in my physiology for insulin resistance. And if that's gone down, then take that A1C, and I had wine, I had the probiotic, shove it. Let me give you an example. And I think this is poignant because a lot of us today, let me see, I lost Harry again. Let me stop the share and see if he's trying to, Harry, you still there?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Never going to have that dreaded thing again. But this is a poignant example of how A1C, which I'm not talking about from a mortality perspective, but how it can, or actually even glucose, yeah, A1C, can mislead a doctor in terms of assuming where you are on the metabolic continuum. So today there are a lot of, real-time glucose monitors. And it can drive you, I think it could drive you crazy. I would never take one, but I think, if you're trying to get out of diabetes, it's probably a good thing.
Absolutely.
But the more insulin resistant you are, the more you're going to see major fluctuations in your glucose. Whereas if your insulin's pretty in the right range, these fluctuations may be minor. So here we have a person, this is American Diabetes Association publication. We have two people. Subject 1 has an A1C of 8. Subject 2 has an A1C of 8. Exactly the same. But look at the variation in their glucose. Dramatically different. Dramatically different. So in this person, they're seeing high spikes of hyperglycemia, excess glucose, and spikes of hypoglycemia. Probably feeling like sweaty and clammy and, tired and fatigued and all that stuff that comes with hypoglycemia. Whereas the hyperglycemia might lead to like tachycardia, Dr. Carter, heart rate elevation, things like that. So what's the difference in these two? Insulin levels must be considered. In my opinion, this person is going into diabetes. In other words, their insulin has gone way up, and now their glucose is fluctuating wildly. Whereas, their A1C is 8. Whereas this person here is becoming more insulin sensitive. So the fluctuations in glucose aren't that great, but the A1C hasn't caught up yet because it's looking back 4 months. So,
but also depending on, what their diet is, because,
sure.
the high glycemic foods, versus low glycemic foods. But even, at a more direct level with your microbiome. And this may potentially be what would be considered a low glycemic food. But if your bacteria flora is not optimal, you still may have some wide fluctuations in your glucose because you're not metabolizing that food as readily. So that's kind of the benefit of using like the Freestyle Libre, and see what happens when you eat a banana versus a slice of bread versus a soda versus some broccoli. You might be very surprised at what happens with the food choices that you have, and then you can kind of tailor things if you're really trying to be diligent about consuming foods that don't upset your glucose level widely, and you can more easily get this under control over a reasonable period of time.
And just be aware, over time, we'll talk about glycemic index. We'll talk about different sweeteners and how they affect sugars. So we'll get into all kinds of nitty-gritty and things that are more organic. Today's sort of like, I want you to understand labs as well. So we're not going to spend the next 3 months on labs. We're doing a little lab survey here, and we'll take a little break that's intense, and then go back to it. So, but these are the kinds of things we look at, and we have to train doctors on how to understand what these things are telling us. These are not the same individuals. They're very, very different. And Dr. Carter makes the point of the microbiome, and I make the point of where they are on the insulin resistance continuum. And both can be playing in this. And this is not something where you give them both insulin. That would be the absolutely wrong thing to do for both these people. So now, the standard of care range and our range aren't that much different for glucose, thankfully. We don't need to be right all the time, but we still would like to see you below 90, really 85 or less. And sometimes it's not, looking at the data today with so many people insulin resistant that, we're going to see higher values showing better results because you're insulin resistant. But it doesn't mean you live better and longer. It just means compared to someone at a lower level, they actually might be hypoglycemic. It's not normal. So I really would stick to 65 to 80. But that's how the data is playing out today. But in individuals with a fasting glucose level, this is something that you folks need to pay attention to, because this is near and dear to being close to normal. In individuals with fasting glucose levels of 100 to 125, each 18 mgs or 18 increasing fasting glucose was associated with a 30% increase in the risk for mortality. So we really want to see you at 90 or below. And David Perlmutter did a lot of research of the literature and said that because the brain is so vascular, he's seeing Alzheimer's onset with people that have consistent value of 95. That's within the standard of care, above our number, but below the standard of care. And Dr. Carter, you want to comment on type 3 diabetes?
Well, yeah, that's a very prevalent cause of Alzheimer's. And of course, Alzheimer's being the third or the fifth leading cause of death, depending on which source you're utilizing. But that, again, is showing the toxicity of, insulin and glucose. But when you have insulin resistance, and of course, the brain loves to use glucose ultimately, but if the glucose cannot get to the cellular level because of the insulin resistance, then the brain is basically being starved. So, and that's also why doing like a short-term ketogenic diet using the coconut oil and so forth can be beneficial, but ultimately you want to get the body back to where it now becomes more sensitive to insulin, because still glucose is the preferred energy source for all of the body, because long-term ketogenic diets actually can be detrimental. 3 to 6 months is really kind of the limit for most people in those scenarios.
Now the next curve, just to give you an idea of the kind of rigor we put into our studies, could be a little confusing, because you see this red curve here that looks like 110 of a glucose is optimal, whereas this curve here shows more of less than 90. So, but the red curve is known prevalent diabetes, and when you're diabetic and you're therefore insulin resistant, you have to have more glucose circulating to meet the cellular demands, because not as much of it's getting in. So it's like blowing a hot air balloon or blowing a balloon. If the balloon is very weak, it's easy to blow it up. Okay, but in insulin resistance, it's like blowing up a hot water bottle. Very hard to blow up. You have to have more pressure of glucose outside to push to get enough glucose into the cell. It seems contradictory to term, but that's what insulin resistance is all about. So you'll see curves where this looks optimal, but I can tell you the blue curve, if you compare the people in the blue to the red, the people in the blue are living longer and living better, even though this looks optimal for that group. They're just insulin resistant. And we cannot go against this information here that says as the glucose goes up, mortality goes up. But you'll have people that are diabetic that become hypoglycemic at a glucose of 140, whereas folks on this call here You're not hypoglycemic until you're around 60 or 55. That's because they have to have that excess glucose to feed their cells because of the insulin resistance. Doesn't make them healthier, it makes them less healthy,
Absolutely.
but that's what they have to
I
have.
understand that, but everything.
That's what they have to have to keep going. Now, Michael, I threw this slide in today. I found it. But this is the New England Journal of Medicine. It's called The Effect of Intensive Glucose Lowering in Type 2 Diabetes. And this is the ACCORD study, the Action to Control Cardiovascular Risk in Diabetes Study Group. And this was published in 2008. And it should be on the front page of the American Diabetes Association, but it's not. It's buried. And what it says is, as compared to standard therapy, the use of intensive therapy, this isn't for you folks, but you have loved ones that might be on insulin. This is important. That if you overdo the insulin, exogenous insulin, to lower glucose to an area where it looks normal for us, but for them, they're really hypoglycemic. Mortality goes up significantly. And actually, in this study, they thought in 2008 that lowering a diabetic's glucose to a normal value that you and I have would be beneficial. And they had to stop the 5-year study in 2 years because people were dying like crazy. Okay. So sadly, when you're insulin resistant, you must have more glucose, but it's a vicious cycle, and you don't want to be
It's a
there.
vicious cycle.
And the best way to address that is really being on the right supplements, you know, in addition to obviously the correct diet that make you more sensitive. Things like berberine and chromium and so forth, and other nutrients, magnesium, zinc, that we're all very deficient in. So optimizing all of those levels are key to turning this puppy around.
So here's another study that we use to determine our limit of the 65 to 90. And this is from the New England Journal of Medicine, too, really the top medical journal. And this would be cancer deaths versus glucose levels. You can see below 95, below 95, below 100. That's really for early mortality, non-cancer, non-vascular deaths. So, but once again, our entire society is skewed. So few are truly insulin sensitive now that even in our study cohorts, we're not even measuring people that are truly insulin sensitive. In none of these studies, not one of these studies, did they say, we have a group of people that are between 2 and 4 for insulin. And we're going to look at them and compare them to 4 to 8 and so on and so on. They're just looking at glucose. So they really have no idea what the insulin level is in these people. That's why even though the upper limit looks beyond what we're saying, the upper limit isn't there because they're not doing enough rigor in their studies, sadly.
Absolutely.
Guess what? Last slide. So let me summarize. Insulin defines diabetes, not A1C, not glucose. It's a disease of insulin resistance. Yes, we can use glucose, A1C, triglycerides as a surrogate for insulin and make some approximations and define diabetes based on those, but that's a human-made term. It's a human-made term strictly. Insulin is there to keep your glucose in a narrow range. It will go up as high as your body will allow it to be synthesized to hold it in that narrow range, and then eventually that glucose will start going up, and then eventually that A1C will start going up. So if you want to be optimally healthy, forget the A1C, forget the glucose. Yeah, you can pay attention to them, they're good barometers, but really you're going to measure your health based on fasting insulin. Anybody have any questions on that?
I do. I have my lab for the last 5 years, and I was just looking at glucose. I just kind of thumbed through here to find it, and
So what's the role of your thyroid in this glucose?
Hold on 1 second, Harry. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to let Alan finish. Maybe you didn't hear him, but go ahead, Alan.
No,
That's okay. Don't worry about it. Alan, finish what you were saying. You measured, you found your glucose.
yeah, I'm looking at 2018, 95, early 2019, 97, late 2019, 103, and just March of this year, 78. Now,
I'll take the 78. I ascribe the 78 to the fact that that guy who was running the health ministry really knew what the heck he was talking about.
Absolutely.
So, what would you attribute that to, the decline? I mean, because I know we try to eat pretty healthy, we exercise regularly, but I don't know what that would have to do with
Well,
glucose.
I remember, Alan, that you guys said you went on a significant fast.
Oh, we do periodic. We have what they call intermittent. Like every Monday we have a 10-hour. Every first, second, and third of every month. Periodically, there's 21-day fast. We just came off of a 40-day fast. Well, we do fast throughout the year, but I'm not sure.
Well, you're actually proving the point that now your glucose, your fasting glucose, is optimal. It should be somewhere between 65 to 85, and you're 73.
Praise God.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I don't recall you being on that kind of fasting schedule when I first met you, Alan.
No, not as often when we first connected, but
That's
it's kind of like our ministry just makes that connection.
You know, I've had people tell me. I just had a consult with this lady today, Joanne, and she says, you know, when you actually see the information about what you're doing, it makes you realize, makes you have a better appreciation for what you're doing. And I think I'm hoping you're just more aware of what you're doing. And so even these little choices you're making now that are better will contribute to that. It's not impossible to get to 78. It really isn't. Let me tell you what percentage of the people in my program that are 78, like 5%. It's not, you know, you've done yeoman's work.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've done yeoman's work, and it's not hard, but it's so culturally, it's against our culture. 3 meals a day, snacks in between. You know, we're never getting into ketosis. We always have a look. I'm snacking all day long. My God, I'm a horrible role model for this. But you know, Jasmine's done 4-day fasts. She's done multiple day fasts, and you know, she's got her insulin down to 2.1. You know, and her glucose 81, 79 kind of thing. And so it's doable. And I think if you want a long, healthy life, like I said, white blood cell counts, fasting insulin.
Yeah, and I intermittent fast every day. I generally only eat 2 meals a day, and yeah, so and my glucose and insulin levels are well within optimal range, and I've done that for years.
Harry, you had a question about thyroid.
Yeah, and sorry, we couldn't hear Alan at all. We couldn't hear that exchange. Well, we heard your side of the exchange, but not
Oh,
Alan.
that's interesting.
Okay. He was just covering his glucose levels, and they've really come down. Really attributable, I think, to the fact that just paying more attention to detail on foods, but also doing a lot more fasting.
Yeah.
Yeah, we sort of gathered that's what he was saying. But
yeah.
So my question was, what's the role of the thyroid in glucose metabolism?
I'm leaving that one to Dr. Carter.
I mean, there's not a real direct connection there. However, significant hypothyroidism can affect that because, hypothyroidism slows your metabolic rate down and so forth. But ultimately, what is the cause of your hypothyroidism, right? Can it be Hashimoto's? And generally, hypothyroidism is due to autoimmune issues. Can that spill over into autoimmune issues with, your pancreas and causing, low levels of insulin being produced, or, antibodies being produced to the receptors so that you become more insulin resistant? Yeah, absolutely. So, the body works in a very complex fashion. So if you have thyroid issues, there could be some connections with, blood glucose management and insulin levels and so forth.
Harry, if you don't give up on us, one of these days, and Karen, one of these days, we'll go over one of my blogs, and the title is The 26 Things That Make You and Keep You Hungry. Okay? And so it kind of gives you the broader picture of what we are up against when it comes to controlling our insulin levels. And I actually don't have thyroid on that. It's like I think Dr. Carter expressed well, it's really kind of secondary, tertiary. You can never deny, the intimate integration of our body's functions to any one thing and think we can isolate it. But I'm really focused on things that are most profound, like people don't think about high protein diet, but glyconeogenesis, you eat a lot of protein, you're going to convert that to glucose.
Yeah.
But why did you ask that? What is the connection that you're making?
Well, I'm not looking at my or Karen's insulin scores right now, but I think they're above the norm that you're describing. And there's been some talk about both of us having thyroid issues of one sort or another. So I was just wondering.
And that's very common, for men and women, especially hypothyroidism. And again, when you go to the traditional doctor and your TSH is elevated, and of course they're most commonly just doing a TSH and a T4, maybe they'll throw a free T3 in there, maybe, but even if they went as far as doing the TPO antibodies and thyroglobulin antibodies, which is more indicative of Hashimoto's, they're still just putting you on, generally speaking, Synthroid, which is the synthetic form of T4. And if your body can't adequately convert that to the active form, which is T3, then you're still behind the 8 ball. But they don't tell you what your body needs. So your body needs zinc and selenium and magnesium to help with that. Those are necessary. Iodine also very, crucial for that conversion process. Also, most of the T4 to T3 conversion actually happens in the gut. So if you have a dysbiosis and bad bacteria in the gut, then your thyroid is not going to function well either. And a whole host of other things that we could go down. But you see, it gets very, convoluted from a traditional doctor's standpoint, because they don't really connect all of those different dots, which is what we do.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
No?
Harry, the one thing is, when we take one measurement every 6 months, we see some variability, and I think there's much more variability probably in the glucose level than the insulin level. I don't know that for a fact. I mean, if each one has its half-life and sensitivity. But I really focus on if your insulin is good, then you're probably okay, even if the fasting glucose may appear on one lab report, one point in time, based on the quality of the fast, slightly elevated. So I won't comment on that, but when you have a choice between choosing what marker to put your, stake your health on, it would be insulin over the glucose, just because of I think you see more variability in the glucose.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Anybody else have any questions?
What are we doing next week?
What are we doing next week? Well, I was trying to get Dr. Carter to talk about shockwave, but he's not going to be available Tuesday. So, anybody have any suggestions? I'm open. We obviously have topics galore, but I would like, because I do get feedback that sometimes it's a little too scientific. So maybe we'll just follow up with this one with just the glycemic index, something. Let's keep it light and simple next week.
Yeah.
That'd be good.
Yeah. We don't want you guys to be in grad school here. That's like, my head hurts thinking about it.
Good.
Yeah.
All right, folks. Blessings to everybody. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank
Thank you.